If we take a map of Europe and split it in two, this is what we observe. If we look at the clubs qualified for the Champions League for the 2025 to 2026 season, there are 30 in the western part of the continent compared to only 6 in the east. If we do exactly the same with the Europa League, the distribution changes slightly but remains unbalanced. 26 clubs in the west, 10 in the east. On the other hand, when we look at the Conference League, the pattern almost reverses. This time, there are far more clubs in the east and significantly fewer in the west. In other words, the further you go down the hierarchy of European competitions, the more clubs shift toward the eastern part of the continent. And the more prestigious the competition, the more the qualified clubs are concentrated in Western Europe. At first glance, this map looks like a simple sporting observation, but in reality, it tells a different story. It shows how money, European qualification spots, and opportunities circulate. And more importantly, it raises a real question. Does this distribution reflect only the sporting level of European countries, or is it the result of a system that structurally favors the same countries over and over again? To understand that, we need to go back long before UEFA's current rules, because Western dominance does not begin with modern UEFA. It is much older than that. First, historically, Western European countries have stronger economies than those in the East, and that directly impacts sport. Stronger economies mean wealthier cities, higher purchasing power, and above all, a public capable of consuming football, buying tickets, subscriptions, sports newspapers, and watching matches on television. Then there is an institutional advantage. Many clubs in Western Europe are better structured and deeply rooted in their local environments. Real Madrid, Bayern Munich, AC Milan, Liverpool, Ajax, or Manchester United did not become giants by accident. They have existed for decades, sometimes since the early 20th century, with stable organizations and strong identities. When European competitions really start to matter in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, these clubs naturally dominate, not because a system is already favoring them, but because they are already the most powerful sporting, economic, and structural forces. On the other hand, many Eastern European clubs operate in far more constrained political and economic contexts, with less private investment, limited infrastructure, and often direct dependence on the state or large public companies. The result is that when the European Cup becomes a major objective, the dice are already largely loaded. The major Western clubs are already present, visible, and competitive. And this is a fundamental point. UEFA did not invent this hierarchy from scratch. It inherited it. But what UEFA would do next is amplify this hierarchy by making certain decisions at the moment. Football began to stop being just a sport and started becoming a product. And that is when television enters the picture and everything changes in the 1990s. At that moment, several phenomena converge: the liberalization of television channels, the rise of pay TV, and above all, the globalization of audiences. Football suddenly becomes an extremely attractive audiovisual product. But television does not think in terms of sporting fairness. It thinks in terms of audience numbers and profitability. What broadcasters are looking for are recognizable clubs, fixtures that resonate with the public, teams capable of attracting millions of viewers, not only domestically, but internationally. And here, one fact becomes obvious. Western European clubs already hold a massive advantage. They come from wealthier countries, they have larger fan bases, they benefit from more developed advertising markets, and they are therefore easier to sell abroad. By contrast, even when an Eastern European club performs well on the pitch, its television potential remains limited. Less purchasing power, fewer subscribers, and less commercial appeal for international broadcasters. From that point on, a new logic takes hold. A club's value no longer depends solely on what it does on the pitch. It also depends on what it represents on a screen. And this logic will deeply influence UEFA's decisions. Because UEFA quickly understands that the value of its competitions depends directly on the clubs it showcases. And it is precisely in this context that, as early as the late 1990s, a very serious threat emerges: the first European Super League project. Long before the attempts of recent years, the biggest clubs on the continent were already considering a closed competition, mainly grouping together the most economically attractive teams. The idea is simple: guarantee their participation every year, secure their revenues, and directly capture the television windfall. This threat is taken extremely seriously by UEFA because if these clubs leave, there is no product left. UEFA then chooses a clear strategy. After threatening participating clubs with lifetime bans from European and domestic competitions, it adapts to the demands of the biggest countries, and the Champions League format evolves. Starting with the 1997 to 1998 edition, the runners-up from the 8 biggest European leagues are allowed to participate. 2 years later, third and fourth place teams from the major leagues are included. The position of Europe's biggest leagues gradually becomes central. One figure perfectly illustrates this shift. In 1998 to 1999, 10 of the 24 Champions League participants came from the 5 major European leagues, representing 42% of the teams. In the 2025 to 2026 edition, the Big Five account for 22 of the 36 qualified clubs, or 61%. This is the result of a compromise. UEFA keeps control, but in exchange, it offers more places, more security, and more money to the clubs and countries with the greatest economic power. From that moment on, European football enters a new era where economic value becomes decisive, and this new balance will be locked in and then reinforced by a central tool of the system, the UEFA coefficient. Because to organize its competitions, UEFA needs a tool to rank countries. In principle, the idea seems logical. Each season, clubs earn points for their country based on their results in European competitions. The more they win, the more points their federation earns, and the more points a country has, the more European places it gets in the following seasons. But the problem is not there. The problem is what this system actually rewards. First, not all competitions are weighted equally. The Champions League awards more points than the Europa League, and the Europa League awards more than the Conference League. In other words, playing in the Champions League not only brings in more money, it also allows a country's coefficient to grow much faster. Second, the coefficient is not calculated over a single season. It is based on the cumulative results of the last 5 years. That means clubs and countries are judged on their past, not on their recent progress. The result is simple. Countries that are already well established in the Champions League keep sending more clubs there. Those clubs win more matches, earn more points, and secure even more places for the following seasons. On the other hand, for Eastern European countries, the situation is far more complicated. They have fewer Champions League spots. They more often have to go through preliminary rounds. They are eliminated earlier, and even when they do reach European competitions, it is often the Europa League or the Conference League, which bring fewer points, less visibility, and less money, and therefore fewer chances to progress in a sustainable way. It is a system that rewards those who are already at the top. The UEFA coefficient does not create inequalities on its own, but it locks them in, and above all, it makes them extremely difficult to catch up. And when a country fails to access the Champions League or the Europa League on a regular basis, another solution is offered, the Conference League. When UEFA created this competition in 2021, the official objective was clear: to ensure that no country is completely excluded from European competitions and to offer a continental stage to clubs that have virtually no chance of reaching the Champions League. On paper, it is a step forward. And to some extent it is, because for many clubs from smaller leagues, taking part in the Conference League is already a major event, especially from a financial point of view. But one thing must be clearly understood: not all European competitions are equal. In terms of revenue distribution, the gap is massive. In the 2024 to 25 season, the Champions League distributed around 2.5 billion euros to participating clubs. The Europa League distributed 565 million euros, and the Conference League only 285 million euros. In other words, the Champions League distributes almost 9 times more money than the Conference League. And this gap is also visible at club level. Young Boys Bern, who finished last in the Champions League phase in 2025 with 0 points, earned 30 million euros. Meanwhile, Chelsea, winners of the Conference League, received around 22 million euros from UEFA. For clubs from the major leagues, this difference is almost marginal. A few million more or less does not fundamentally change their economic model. But for clubs from Eastern Europe or peripheral leagues, it is the opposite. These amounts can represent a huge share of the annual budget, sometimes 30 or even 40% of a club's total revenue. The Conference League therefore allows clubs to exist and sometimes even to professionalize, but it does not really allow them to catch up with the elite. Because clubs playing in the Conference League earn less money, they earn fewer coefficient points, and therefore have fewer chances to access higher competitions. This is the core ambiguity of the system. The Conference League gives almost everyone a place, but it also entrenches a very clear hierarchy. At the top, the Champions League, largely reserved for already dominant countries. In the middle, the Europa League. And at the bottom, a competition for everyone else. And that is precisely why the map of Europe remains almost unchanged year after year. And this suits UEFA perfectly. Not because it is deliberately trying to exclude part of Europe, but because this system is the one that maximizes the value and revenues of its major competitions. To understand this, let's imagine a simple scenario. A Champions League based on a perfectly equal principle, with only one club per country. On paper, it is fairer, but in reality, the consequences would be immediate. Fewer big clubs qualified means fewer high-profile matchups between prestigious teams, and therefore mechanically lower audiences. Lower audiences mean fewer broadcasters interested, and fewer interested broadcasters mean far less money for UEFA. Yet today, the value of the Champions League rests precisely on those matchups, on the regular presence of the most popular clubs, those that drive up television rights bidding. Without them, there is no longer a true premium product. This is where the core of the problem lies. UEFA is not arbitrating between sporting justice and injustice. It is arbitrating between economic attractiveness and the collapse of the value of its competitions. And within that logic, maintaining a strong concentration of Western European clubs in the Champions League is a condition for the survival of the current model. The Conference League then plays a very specific role. It allows the entire continent to be included, without ever calling into question the economic balance at the top. This is therefore not a system designed to rebalance Europe. It is a system designed to preserve what generates the most value. And as long as European football depends so heavily on television, audiences, and the revenues they generate, these maps will remain almost unchanged. The real question at the end of the day is this: would a more equal European football actually be better, or would it simply become less attractive? Feel free to share your opinion in the comments. And if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like it, boost it, and subscribe so you don't miss the next ones. See you soon for a new video. Bye.